The afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle golden haze, the kind of light that made even the most ordinary hedgerows and garden paths seem enchanted. In the heart of the village, the immaculate garden of Colonel and Mrs. Carraway was alive with the soft murmur of polite conversation, the delicate clink of teacups, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was the annual summer garden party, a fixture in the local social calendar, where villagers, friends, and a sprinkling of curious outsiders gathered in the midst of fragrant roses and neatly trimmed box hedges. Miss Marple, wearing her usual faded floral dress and sensible hat, moved quietly along the gravel paths, her eyes taking in every detail. She had accepted Mrs. Carraway's invitation without any particular expectation, but she found herself, as always, curious about the undercurrents of human behaviour hidden beneath polite smiles. From her vantage point near a trellis of honeysuckle, she noted the Carraways' neighbours, the Somersets, speaking in low tones with their daughter Edith, whose delicate cough had drawn discreet concern from several ladies, Mr. Pettigrew examining the intricate flower arrangements as though solving an invisible puzzle, and the vicar's wife bustling about, ensuring that no one's teacup was ever less than half full. The charm of the afternoon was, however, sharply interrupted. From the far end of the lawn, a sudden piercing scream cut through the hum of conversation. Miss Marple turned instinctively, her hand clutching the strap of her handbag, as the villagers collectively froze. It was Edith Somerset standing by the ornamental fountain, her face pale as if the sun itself had drained the colour from her cheeks. "Oh, it's dreadful, absolutely dreadful," she cried, her voice trembling. "In the rose-bed. There's a body." Within moments, the crowd surged toward the fountain, a mix of fear, fascination and gossip igniting in equal measure. Miss Marple, however, remained near the honeysuckle, observing. There, sprawled unnaturally among the crimson blooms of a half-pruned rosebush, lay the lifeless form of Mr. Hugo Worthing, a solicitor recently arrived from London and known for his keen mind and, some whispered, his indiscreet tongue. His eyes were closed, his hands stiffer at his sides, and a small ornamental spade, part of a garden display, was overturned beside him. Gasps echoed through the gathering. "Mrs." Carraway clutched her pearl necklace as if it were a lifeline. "Oh, how dreadful! Who could have done this?" she wailed, her eyes darting about the crowd. Yet amid the chaos, Miss Marple's keen gaze noted subtler signs. The footprints pressed into the soft soil nearby did not belong to the gardener, who had been tending the far border, nor did they seem like a hurried flight. A fragment of a ribbon, pale blue, rested atop the roses, slightly crushed but intact. And most intriguingly, there was a faint, lingering scent of lavender. Not the garden variety, but a distinct perfume, one used sparingly by someone careful to leave no trace. While the villagers murmured and speculated, Miss Marple quietly made her way toward the fountain. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The outward appearances of a peaceful village had once again concealed a deadly truth, and she had the patience, as always, to uncover it. By the time the police arrived, summoned in a flurry of telegrams and hurried messages, Miss Marple had already memorized several crucial details: the orientation of the body, the position of the spade, the reactions of those nearby, and, most importantly, the hidden tension simmering beneath the genteel surface of St. Mary Mead. As Inspector Craddock took charge, barking instructions and trying to restore order, Miss Marple retreated to the edge of the crowd. She had no desire to appear forward or interfering, but her mind was already piecing together fragments. Small human behaviours, glances exchanged too quickly, a hesitation here, a forced laugh there. Each would eventually lead her to the truth, though she would reveal it only when the time was precisely right. In St. Mary Mead, murder was a rarity. Yet as Miss Marple watched the villagers cluster, whisper and speculate, she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle waiting to be solved. And she knew, as she always did, that beneath the calm exterior of any village lay secrets long buried, sometimes forgotten, but never entirely gone. The crowd at the fountain had barely begun to settle when the first whispers started to circulate. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, then growing in volume until they became a persistent hum of speculation. Mrs. Carraway clutched her fan, fanning herself with an air of polite alarm, while her husband paced with furrowed brows, muttering about the inconvenience of such a disturbance during a perfectly respectable gathering. "It's most untimely, surely," he remarked to a neighbour, though his eyes darted nervously toward the police officers cordoning off the rose-bed. "Did you see him here this morning?" one woman asked, addressing another with a mixture of curiosity and accusation. "I thought he was meant to be in London, attending that case." "People come and go, don't they?" replied her Her companion, sipping her tea in a way meant to suggest calm observation, yet her hand trembled slightly, betraying the tension beneath her carefully composed demeanour. Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively near the edge of the lawn, let these murmurs wash over her without interruption. She noted every flick of an eye, every slight turn of the head, and the subtle tightening of lips when certain names were mentioned. The village had its own rhythm of gossip, and in it lay patterns that were as revealing as any overt action. From across the lawn, Edith Somerset's mother whispered to the vicar's wife, her tone a mixture of outrage and fear. "I should think the police will find it was an accident, though I cannot imagine how such a thing could happen with so many people about." Her eyes, however, continually flicked toward Miss Marple as if the older lady might somehow possess some hidden knowledge. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock was methodically taking statements, his notebook filling with observations, though his impatience with the villagers' endless speculation was evident. "Now everyone, please remain calm," he called, trying to restore order, though his voice carried the subtle edge of frustration. "We will take each statement, but we must avoid conjecture for the moment." Miss Marple, as always, made no overt attempts to interfere. Instead, she began to consider the individuals gathered, thinking of how long she had known each of them, and how certain behaviours, though ordinary in appearance, might reveal truths that even the keenest inspector could overlook. Mr. Pettigrew, who had been examining the flower beds with unusual intensity, had a slight smudge of soil on his cuff, though he was careful not to notice. Carraway's neighbour, Mrs. Larkin, had left her gloves slightly askew, a subtle sign of nervous agitation. Even the vicar's wife, bustling about with her habitual efficiency, betrayed a faint crease between her brows when Hugo Worthing's name was spoken aloud. As the police continued their inquiries, small arguments began to flare. "I saw someone near the fountain just before the scream," insisted one of the local school teachers, her hand gesturing wildly. "He or she was acting very strangely." Another villager, a retired army officer, countered, "Nonsense, the boy was harmless. Probably stumbled over the garden hose or something of the sort. Let's not be hasty with accusations." In the midst of these contradictions, Miss Marple noticed a pattern forming, not in the words themselves, but in the reactions. Certain names elicited immediate avoidance, glances shifted too quickly, and fingers unconsciously twitched toward hidden pockets or clasped hands. She made a mental note of these subtleties, knowing they would eventually illuminate the darker corners of this seemingly tranquil village. A minor commotion drew her attention to the far side of the lawn, where a young man, apparently new to St. Mary Mead, was being questioned by a constable. His voice was steady, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease whenever the conversation touched upon the late Mr. Worthing. Miss Marple observed silently, noting the slight stiffening of his posture, the involuntary tapping of his foot. There was significance in such things, and she filed each observation carefully away in her mind. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of curiosity that always accompanied the onset of a mystery. She could see that the village, normally so ordered and polite, had become a web of hidden tensions and quiet apprehensions, and she understood, as she always did, that it was only by patiently untangling these threads, listening, observing and waiting, that the true story would ultimately emerge. Even as Inspector Craddock wrapped up the initial statements, Miss Marple knew that the real investigation had barely begun, the outward calm of St. Owen. Mary Mead was deceptive. Beneath it lay secrets, some buried for years, others only recently concealed. And she, with her gentle persistence and sharp perception, would uncover them all in due course. The day wore on, and Sancti. Mary Mead, normally so serene, seemed suspended in a quiet tension, as if the very air had grown wary. Miss Marple moved slowly along the edge of the garden, exchanging brief, polite greetings with those who passed, all the while observing, listening and noting. Each villager displayed their version of composure, some genuine, some carefully constructed, yet beneath every smile or nervous twitch lay small inconsistencies that her mind catalogued with quiet precision. The Somersets, still visibly shaken, had retreated to a shaded corner with Edith nestled between her parents, seeking comfort. Miss Marple paused nearby, noting how Mrs. Somerset's hand lingered on Edith's shoulder, trembling slightly, and how Mr. Somerset kept glancing toward the rose bed with a mixture of fear and irritation. It was clear that while their concern appeared maternal, there was something more, a subtle defensiveness, a hint that they too might be harbouring secrets. Across the lawn, Mr. Pettigrew had resumed his examination of the garden, though now with the wary, calculated precision of someone keen to avoid suspicion. He stooped to inspect a broken branch near the fountain, muttering under his breath, and Miss Marple observed a faint smudge on the cuff of his sleeve that seemed newly acquired. A casual gesture, almost imperceptible, but she filed it away, He might have been innocent, or he might not. At this stage, all small anomalies merited attention. Meanwhile, the inspector had begun questioning the guests one by one. Miss Marple allowed herself to overhear the conversations without interjecting. The accounts varied wildly. One claimed to have seen a shadow near the fountain, another insisted Krummelbap. Worthing had seemed nervous earlier in the morning, while yet another suggested it could have been a tragic accident. Human memory, she reflected, was a curious thing, prone to exaggeration, selective omission, and subtle distortion. Yet within these contradictions often lay the truth, waiting to be teased out by careful observation. As the afternoon deepened, a faint commotion drew her attention toward a narrow path at the far edge of the property. There, Mrs. Hughes. Larkin was speaking in low tones with the vicar's wife, her expression a mixture of shock and restrained excitement. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Larkin's hand gripped her handbag with unusual force, knuckles white against the leather. Her voice trembled, yet she spoke with careful diction as though rehearsing each word to avoid an inadvertent revelation. Miss Marple quietly noted the interplay of anxiety and deliberate self-control, an interesting combination that might prove significant. It was in these quiet, peripheral details that Miss Marple began to perceive the outlines of motive and opportunity. Small quarrels from years past, slight rivalries among neighbours, minor grievances, all seemed trivial when observed individually, but together they formed a network of possible resentments, tensions, and hidden fears. She thought of the village churchyard, with its neatly aligned stones, some forgotten, some meticulously maintained, and wondered if the past might yet cast a long shadow over the present. By late afternoon, the gathering had thinned, leaving a few lingering villagers and the inevitable press of curious onlookers. The police had secured the scene and would return in the morning to conduct a more thorough search. Yet Miss Marple knew that the initial observations, what people had said, how they had reacted, what small unintentional gestures they had betrayed, were already more valuable than any official report could convey. As she walked along the edge of the rose garden, her gaze fell upon the faint impression of footprints in the softened soil, nearly erased by the passing of shoes and the sweeping of rakes. She knelt briefly, tracing the patterns with her eyes, noting the subtle direction of each step, the slight differences in depth that suggested hesitation or retracing. Even the placement of a small discarded ribbon near the fountain began to form a puzzle in her mind, its colour and texture connecting faintly with something she had observed earlier in the day. Miss Marple straightened and surveyed the garden one final time before leaving. The sun had dipped low, casting long, slanting shadows across the lawn, and a soft chill had settled over the air. She understood that the village's surface calm was deceptive. Underneath, motives, histories, and concealed animosities had begun to align into patterns visible only to those who watched carefully. And she, as always, would wait patiently for the subtle signs that would eventually illuminate the path to truth. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed caught between the ordinary and the extraordinary, the quiet of twilight making every rustle of leaves and distant crow more pronounced. Miss Marple walked slowly along the narrow lanes leading away from the Caraway garden, her steps measured and her mind alert. Though the garden party had dispersed, the ripples of the day's shock were far from settling. Small clusters of villagers lingered on doorsteps, exchanging whispered theories and worried glances. Even the faintest movements, she knew, could betray truths more potent than the words they spoke aloud. Miss Marple paused near the old stone bridge over the mill stream, noticing the way the evening light glanced off the water, and the way certain villagers, returning home or simply strolling, avoided each other's gaze. She reflected on the subtle hierarchy that ran beneath St. Mary Mead's seemingly polite surface. The outward composure of each person she knew was carefully constructed, often to mask something more complex and troubling. In the rose garden, the outwardly tranquil setting had concealed a murder. Here, in the fading light, the same meticulous veneer hid nervous tensions, unresolved resentments, and perhaps even fear. Back at the Caraway residence, Inspector Craddock was conferring with the sergeant, laying out the initial observations and trying to make sense of the conflicting statements. Miss Marple, quietly observing from a distance, noted the officer's reliance on the most visible evidence. The location of the body, the overturned spade, the footprints in the soil. Yet she was aware that such details, though important, were often misleading if divorced from the patterns of human behaviour that accompanied them. The true story, she mused, was rarely found solely in objects. It resided in the reactions, hesitations, and contradictions of those present. Mrs. Caraway, recovering from her initial shock, flitted about indoors, offering tea and light reassurances to the few remaining guests. Her gestures were smooth, practiced, yet Miss Marple observed a faint tension in her shoulders, a slight tightness in pause around the eyes that spoke of hidden anxieties. No one else seemed to notice. Their attention was absorbed by the tragedy itself and the eagerness to assign blame. Miss Marple made a mental note. Mrs. Carraway's concern, though outwardly gracious, was not entirely selfless. There was an undercurrent there, subtle but unmistakable, and it might reveal itself in time. Out in the village, conversations continued to spread like wildfire. Some whispered that Hugo Worthing's presence in St. Albans, Mary Mead, had been unwelcome to certain local families. Others speculated about financial disputes or personal slights. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, collected these fragments of gossip like threads to weave a broader understanding of the social fabric. She was careful not to pass judgment, recognizing that while some statements were exaggerated or coloured by fear, others held kernels of truth, often overlooked in the rush to assume the obvious. As twilight deepened, a small deliberate commotion drew her attention. A delivery boy had arrived at the Carraway house, bearing a letter that had been sent earlier in the day but delayed. The envelope, stamped with a London postmark, carried a name now heavy with implication. Hugo Worthing. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Carraway's quick intake of breath and the almost imperceptible hand tremor as she accepted it. The letter, though unseen by Miss Marple, seemed to shift the atmosphere subtly, introducing a layer of intrigue that was yet unspoken but palpably felt. Walking back along the lane toward her own cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulation of small details. The placement of the spade, the footprints in the road, the pale blue ribbon, the fleeting expressions of fear or discomfort. All these were pieces of a puzzle that once assembled would reveal far more than any individual observation could. The village's gentle evening stillness, punctuated by the occasional distant call of a night bird, contrasted sharply with the inner turbulence she sensed among its residents. Each of them, in some way, was connected to the unfolding mystery, and in each connection lay a potential clue. By the time Miss Marple reached her quiet sitting room, dusk had deepened to night, and the village seemed to hold its breath. She poured herself a cup of tea, her mind already working through the possibilities, considering the subtle inconsistencies she had noted, and predicting the ways human behaviour might betray the truth in Saint. Mary Mead, she knew, appearances could deceive, but patience, keen observation, and gentle questioning would, in time, reveal what had been hidden for too long. The following morning arrived overcast, the clouds hanging low as if mirroring the sombre mood of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early, making her way to the village churchyard before breakfast, drawn by a quiet intuition she rarely ignored. The familiar stones, some neat and cared for, others weathered and forgotten, seemed to hold more than the names of the departed. They held whispers of past grievances, lingering, resentments and forgotten promises. She paused by a row of older graves, noting the subtle erosion that left inscriptions partially illegible, and a faintly tilted cross that suggested neglect rather than carelessness. Even in a place meant for repose, the human imprint of attention and neglect offered stories waiting to be read. Back at the Carraway house, activity had resumed in more fits and starts. Inspector Craddock was back, this time more methodical, issuing instructions to his assistants and coordinating with local constables to secure the area and begin a proper search for evidence. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, drifted among the edges of the group, listening quietly as questions were posed and answers given. The villagers' responses were a mixture of truth, conjecture, and instinctive deflection. Each one revealed something about their character, even when they attempted to conceal it. Mr. Pettigrew, who had seemed so innocuous yesterday, had already been approached for further questioning. He claimed to have been inspecting the garden at the time of the murder, yet his voice betrayed a subtle strain, a tiny hesitation before each answer. Miss Marple, observing from a shaded corner near the kitchen windows, noted how his eyes flicked briefly toward the far rosebed when he spoke, almost as though some part of him hoped no one would notice. She did not intervene, but made a careful mental note, as she always did. The Somersets had arrived at the house again, this time to offer their own recollections. Edith, still pale and somewhat withdrawn, sat quietly near her mother, while her father spoke at length with the inspector. Miss Marple observed the interplay between them. Mr. Somerset's insistence on emphasising his daughter's composure contrasted sharply with Mrs. Somerset's frequent, almost compulsive glances toward the rosebed, as though she feared the past might reach out to touch the present. Subtle as these cues were, they suggested more than casual concern, hinting at a private worry that she might reveal only under the right circumstance. A faint commotion at the far end of the lawn drew Miss Marple's attention. Mrs. Larkin had arrived, her carefully restrained expression momentarily slipping as she spoke to a constable about her observations. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, flicked repeatedly toward a small pile of overturned flower pots near the fountain, one of which contained remnants of the pale blue ribbon Miss Marple had noticed the previous day. The constable appeared unconcerned, dismissing it as a minor accident, but Miss Marple's keen eyes recorded the detail immediately. Small, seemingly irrelevant objects often proved to be decisive. Inside the house, a letter addressed to Hugo Worthing had been opened, revealing its contents to Inspector Craddock and Mrs. Carroway. Miss Marple, passing by, caught a glimpse of the letter and the slight furrow of Mrs. Carroway's brow. The communication, mundane as it seemed, contained subtle indications of tension, mention of a meeting and a request for discretion that now seemed ominous in light of the recent events. She pondered the connections quietly. Messages, minor quarrels, subtle gestures, and the placement of objects, all forming a lattice of potential motives and opportunities. By mid-morning, the police had begun documenting the rosebed and surrounding area. Miss Marple observed their methods with polite curiosity, noting how they focused on footprints, soil disturbances, and the immediate physical evidence, largely overlooking the social cues that seemed far more revealing. She understood that human behaviour often left the most permanent traces, and that the villagers' interactions, nervous glances, sudden recollections, carefully measured words were far more illuminating than soil impressions or displaced flower pots. As she finally stepped back, surveying the scene once more, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of quiet satisfaction. The day was still young, yet the first outlines of the puzzle were becoming discernible. The subtle cues, the inconsistencies, the glimpses of hidden anxieties all pointed toward an underlying truth, one that would require patience, careful attention, and the gentle coaxing of human nature to fully uncover instantly. Mary Mead, as always, appearances were deceptive, but Miss Marple had learned that nothing, even the most well-guarded secret, remained hidden indefinitely. By midday, the Carroway garden had taken on an air of uneasy formality. The initial shock had given way to a careful restraint, as villagers went about their business with polite whispers and sideways glances. Miss Marple, seated on a wrought-iron bench near the edge of the lawn, observed the evolving dynamics with patient attentiveness. She had long understood that the outward calm of St. Mary Mead rarely indicated true serenity. Beneath it lay a complex web of interactions and hidden motives. Inspector Craddock had organised a systematic inquiry, calling in several villagers to recount their movements and observations during the fatal moments. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting how each account subtly contradicted the others. Mr. Pettigrew maintained his story of inspecting the flower beds, yet his hands, faintly smudged with soil, betrayed something unspoken. Mrs. Larkin emphasised her attentiveness to the fountain, yet her anxious glances toward the rosebed revealed an undercurrent of fear or perhaps guilt. Even the Somersets, who appeared composed, exchanged furtive glances when certain questions were asked, hinting at concerns they preferred to keep private. A new visitor arrived quietly, a Mr. Lionel Hargrove, a local historian with an interest in St. Mary Mead's past. He had been researching the old churchyard when he happened to hear of the incident. With an air of casual curiosity, he approached Miss Marple. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I hope you won't mind my intrusion, but I couldn't help thinking that the churchyard itself may be more relevant than we imagine. There are graves, some long forgotten, that carry their own stories. Old resentments, disputes over inheritances, even family feuds. Some of them might intersect with today's tragedy." Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "Indeed, Mr. Hargrove, the past often leaves faint echoes that resonate far longer than one anticipates. Even the smallest incident may have roots in something long forgotten, and those echoes sometimes guide the present in curious ways." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the fountain. Edith Somerset had wandered closer, her steps hesitant, and paused to stare at the overturned spade and the trampled roses. Miss Marple noticed how her eyes lingered not on the body, which had been removed, but on a slight disturbance in the soil and the pale blue ribbon that had remained unnoticed by most. Edith bent down and touched it, then quickly withdrew her hand as though startled. Miss Marple, observing from a distance, recorded the reaction silently. There was a story behind that small gesture, though Edith herself may not have been aware of it. Inspector Craddock had begun to gather statements about interactions earlier in the morning, questioning who had spoken to Hugo Worthing and whether any conflicts had arisen. The villagers' answers were tentative, polite, yet occasionally revealing. A whisper of irritation here, a subtle pause there. These were the clues Miss Marple valued most. They were far more telling than the physical evidence alone. By mid-afternoon, the constables had completed their inspection of the rosebed. They were satisfied that there were no new disturbances to record, yet Miss Marple lingered, observing the minutiae, the precise orientation of footprints, the faint impressions of hands on the soil, the position of small objects. All could indicate more than mere happenstance. Her gaze fell again upon the ribbon, noting the way it was slightly crushed yet intact, suggesting it had been placed or dropped deliberately, rather than being an accidental remnant of the commotion. Miss Marple rose and began a slow walk along the garden's edge, her mind weaving together the disparate threads. The minor discrepancies in behaviour, the faint traces of anxiety, the subtle signs of avoidance, all hinted at concealed motives. She considered how each person's history, their relationship to the victim, and their interactions during the party might intersect. In Saint Mary Mead, she reflected, nothing happened in isolation. Every gesture, every whispered word, and every hidden glance contributed to the intricate tapestry of human behaviour. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small, unnoticed doorway at the side of the Carraway house. It led to a storage area where gardening tools and sundry objects were kept. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint scent of lavender, distinct, deliberate, drifted from within. She paused, considering the possibility that something overlooked here might shed light on the events of the previous day. The investigation, she realised, was far from complete, and the most telling clues often lay in the quietest corners, waiting for an observant eye to discover them. Miss Marple lingered near the slightly ajar storage door, her keen eyes noting the disorder within. Gardening tools lay scattered across the floor, some leaning against the wall, others tipped over as though hastily used or moved. Amid the mundane clutter, a faint glimmer of metal caught her eye, an unremarkable letter opener, its surface smudged and dulled. She crouched slightly to observe it, noting the absence of any blood or obvious trace of violence. Yet the tool's displacement suggested it might have been involved in a struggle, or at least handled with care. The human element, she reminded herself, was more telling than mere physical evidence. From the corner of the yard, Mr. Pettigrew had begun pacing once again, ostensibly to inspect the flower beds, though his glances continually returned toward the storage area. Miss Marple noticed how he avoided making direct eye contact with anyone else, his steps measured but tense, his hands occasionally brushing against his coat as though to soothe a rising anxiety. The subtle signs of internal agitation, so easily missed by those focused solely on tangible evidence, were never lost on her. A soft voice called from the house, drawing her attention back to the main lawn. Mrs. Carraway had summoned Edith Somerset inside, ostensibly to offer her tea and comfort. Yet Miss Marple observed the calculated precision of her movements. Mrs. Carraway's gestures, while outwardly hospitable, bore the faintest trace of control, a desire to direct attention, to manage the narrative unfolding before the villagers' eyes. Such instincts, she noted, were often motivated by more than mere propriety. They could conceal concern, complicity, or even anxiety about what might emerge if left unchecked. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, had begun questioning the remaining guests individually, seeking corroboration for statements made earlier. Miss Marple, as always, moved unobtrusively, listening to fragments of conversation that might seem irrelevant to a casual observer. She noted how certain villagers stumbled when recounting seemingly trivial interactions with Hugo Worthing, how glances shifted, and how hands subtly fidgeted with gloves or handkerchiefs. Each small signal, she knew, held significance. The careful reading of human behaviour could reveal truths far beyond what the surface suggested. In the garden's corner, Mrs. Larkin lingered near a flowering shrub, speaking quietly with the vicar's wife. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the way Mrs. Larkin's hand rested against the plant, brushing aside a petal or two with deliberate slowness. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it seemed to mirror her inner state, tentative, controlled, and concealing some unease. Even as she appeared composed, there was a tension woven into the movement that suggested more than mere anxiety about the morning's events. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to sweep across the garden once more, taking in the arrangement of footprints, disturbed soil, and the faintly pressed ribbon near the fountain. Each detail, minor in isolation, contributed to a growing sense of pattern, connections between people, objects, and behaviour that were invisible to anyone not attuned to human nature. The quiet tension among the villagers, the faint inconsistencies in their statements, and the subtle cues of nervousness all pointed toward a truth that would reveal itself only with patience and careful observation. As the afternoon waned, a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of lavender from the storage area, mingling with the summer air. Miss Marple paused, inhaling subtly, recognizing the significance. Perfumes, like gestures, could serve as unintentional markers, hinting at presence, intention, or deception. Here was a detail that had been overlooked by those focused solely on the obvious. She filed it carefully in her mind alongside the ribbon, the footprints, and the faint agitation in several of the villagers. By the time she retreated toward the main path, Miss Marple sensed that the threads of the morning's events were beginning to interlace. The outward calm of St. Mary Mead was deceptive. Beneath it, motives, fears, and hidden tensions were converging. She understood, as she always did, that the path to truth required patience. The pieces of the puzzle were visible, if only in faint outlines, and the subtle nuances of human behaviour would ultimately illuminate the full picture, revealing the culprit who had so cleverly concealed themselves amidst the ordinary rhythms of village life. As evening fell, a soft golden light settled over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the gardens and narrow lanes. Miss Marple, having returned to her cottage briefly, could not resist the pull of curiosity. She set out once more, taking the familiar path toward the Caraway residence. The village, though outwardly calm, seemed charged with an undercurrent of tension, each shadow and sound hinting at unease. The earlier events had left a subtle residue upon every household. Polite conversation was now tinged with hesitation, laughter with restraint, and small gestures carried careful meaning. Arriving at the house, Miss Marple observed that the inspector and his constables were completing the day's formal inquiries. Statements had been taken, sketches made of the rose bed and footprints, yet the real puzzle, human behaviour, remained largely unexplored. She moved quietly among the remaining villagers, noting reactions, gestures, and subtle shifts in posture. Mr. Pettigrew lingered near the fountain, hands clasped behind his back, a faint crease in his brow betraying thoughtfulness that seemed more than casual concern. Mrs. Larkin conversed in measured tones with the vicar's wife, yet every few moments she glanced toward the rosebed, her expression carefully modulated to hide a deeper interest. Edith Somerset had returned from indoors, drawn once again to the flower bed where the earlier tragedy had occurred. She knelt slightly, her eyes examining the faintly disturbed soil. Miss Marple approached unobtrusively, noting the way Edith's fingers hovered over the pale blue ribbon without touching it, as if reluctant to disturb its position. The young woman's subtle hesitation, the careful way she avoided disturbing anything, suggested an awareness of the significance of details beyond what she herself may have articulated. Miss Marple filed the observation quietly in her mind. Often the actions unspoken were the most revealing. Inspector Craddock, sensing that the investigation had reached a lull, began to confer with the sergeant about the next steps. He intended to canvass the village more thoroughly, hoping to uncover additional witnesses or insights. Miss Marple, listening from a shaded corner, noted the direction of his attention, mostly on what could be measured, catalogued, or documented. She reflected that human behaviour, the unquantifiable reactions and subtle gestures, was far more instructive at this stage. A pause in speech, a shift of weight, the avoidance of eye contact. These were often the threads from which the truth could be woven. Across the garden, Mrs. Caraway moved among the remaining guests, offering reassurances and polite commentary, yet Miss Marple discerned a tension beneath her composed exterior. The slight stiffness in her hands, the controlled modulation of her voice, suggested an attentiveness that was not purely hospitable. There was a need to manage perception, perhaps even to conceal anxiety about what might emerge if left unchecked. Each action, as always, had its counterpart in motivation, a subtle hint at what lay beneath the surface. Miss Marple's attention was drawn back to the storage area near the side of the house. The faint scent of lavender lingered, mingling with the evening air, and a slight disturbance in the scattered gardening tools suggested a recent passage, deliberate or otherwise. She considered the possibilities quietly, aware that such small markers, objects out of place, scents carried unintentionally, often indicated both presence and intention. A soft voice behind her interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Marple, might I trouble you for a moment?" It was Mr. Lionel Hargrove, the local historian. "I was reflecting on what you mentioned earlier about the churchyard. It occurred to me that some graves, particularly those forgotten or neglected, might hold a clue. Old disputes, perhaps even grudges that were never entirely laid to rest." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "Indeed, Mr. Hargrove. People often leave traces of themselves far longer than they realise. Even forgotten graves may whisper truths to those willing to listen. Her eyes swept over the fading light of the village, settling briefly on the outlines of the churchyard in the distance. A quiet anticipation stirred within her. The subtle interweaving of past and present, human behaviour and long-buried secrets was beginning to take a more defined shape. By the time the sun fully dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple had gathered a clear sense of the intricate web forming around Hugo Worthing's death. The village's polite exterior remained intact, yet beneath it, small tensions, nervous gestures, and fleeting glances formed a lattice of possible motives and concealed truths. She understood, as she always did, that patience and careful observation would soon illuminate the precise contours of deception hiding in plain sight, waiting for the subtle, coaxing of an observant mind. As the night deepened over Seymour, Mary Mead, a gentle hush settled upon the village, broken only by the occasional murmur of the wind through the trees. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a small lamp casting a warm glow over her knitting, reflected on the day's observations. Every interaction, every gesture, every subtle sign of unease among the villagers had been noted, catalogued quietly in her mind. She understood that the outward calm of the evening was deceptive. Beneath it lay the currents of fear, tension, and perhaps guilt, rippling invisibly through the community. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. It was Mr. Lionel Hargrove, carrying a small notebook and a lantern to light his way. "I hope I am not intruding at a late hour, Miss Marple," he said with a polite bow, "but I thought it might be helpful to review some of the records I have regarding the older graves in the churchyard. Some of the families have histories that are interesting, to say the least." Miss Marple gestured for him to enter, and together they settled at the table. Hargrove spread out his notes, names, dates, minor disputes, inheritances, and the occasional mention of quarrels that had once divided families now long buried. "It is remarkable," Hargrove remarked, "how tensions that seem trivial at the time can echo across decades. Some of these families have never truly forgiven, even for the smallest of slights." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, the smallest seed of resentment, once sown, may grow silently over years, sometimes flowering in unexpected ways. We must consider how the past intersects with the present. It is often the human nature entwined with history that guides the hand of mischief, or worse." Her eyes narrowed slightly as she considered Hugo Worthing's presence in the village, brief though it had been, and the subtle frictions it seemed to have stirred. A sudden noise at the window drew her attention, a soft tap, almost imperceptible, followed by a shadow flitting across the garden path. Miss Marple rose and looked out, noting a figure moving cautiously near the storage area she had inspected earlier. The faint lavender scent that had intrigued her before seemed stronger, carried on the cool night air. The movement was deliberate, careful, yet somehow anxious. Hargrove glanced out as well. "Curious," he murmured. "That area should be empty at this hour. Could it be one of the villagers still at the Caraway house?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Hargrove. Observe the hesitation in the figure's movement, the care in avoiding the well-trodden paths. This is not casual wandering. Someone wishes to remain unseen, yet feels compelled to be here." They watched silently as the figure paused near the scattered tools, bending briefly as if to retrieve something. The subtle movements, the attention to detail, and the faint nervous energy all spoke to Miss Marple's trained eye. The individual's behaviour was cautious but purposeful, hinting at knowledge or possession of something significant. After a few moments, the figure straightened and moved back toward the lane, vanishing into the night. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind already piecing together what the observation might signify. There were connections here that had been overlooked. The faint ribbon, the lavender scent, the subtle disturbances in the storage area, all pointed to someone intimately involved, though careful enough to avoid immediate detection. Hargrove, flipping through his notebook once more, remarked quietly, "It is as if the past itself is guiding the present, Miss Marple." One cannot help but wonder if these echoes of old disputes have resurfaced in ways the villagers themselves do not yet recognise. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a small expression of satisfaction. "Yes, Mr. Hargrove, and it is in those subtle, almost imperceptible traces that the truth will ultimately reveal itself. One must observe, listen, and wait. In time, the carefully concealed actions, the nervous gestures, and the small disturbances of human behaviour will converge to expose the hand behind the deed." As the night deepened, she made a quiet mental note to revisit the storage area at first light. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, and the subtle cues she had observed over the day and evening, combined with the histories revealed by Hargrove, were beginning to form a coherent pattern. It would require patience, tact, and precise observation, but she sensed the moment of revelation was drawing nearer, like a faint glow on the horizon. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke under a pale sun that did little to dispel the lingering unease from the previous day. Miss Marple set out early, her walking stick tapping softly on the cobbled lanes as she made her way toward the Carroway property. The village was quiet, the occasional window curtain twitching as villagers began their day, all of them carrying the unspoken weight of the tragedy. Even in such stillness she detected subtle movements, furtive glances exchanged, doors opening and closing just slightly too quickly, hesitant footsteps on familiar paths. Every detail added another layer to the complex tapestry of human behaviour she was quietly unravelling. Upon reaching the Carroway garden, she found Inspector Craddock and his constables already present, preparing to revisit the scene with a more thorough inspection. The rosebed had been cordoned off again, footprints carefully marked, and the storage area near the side door examined in the faint morning light. Miss Marple lingered at a respectful distance, noting the manner in which Mr. Pettigrew approached the cordoned-off area. His measured steps, brief hesitation before looking around, and the slight clench of his hands indicated the continuing tension she had observed the previous day. Each movement, minor though it seemed, was laden with potential significance. Mrs. Carroway flitted about the property, ensuring the remaining guests were comfortable, yet Miss Marple observed a subtle strain in her composed gestures. Her eyes betrayed a quiet anxiety, a careful monitoring of every interaction, as though she feared someone might reveal a truth she preferred hidden. Even her conversation with Edith Somerset was laden with minute cues, the way she directed the young woman's attention, the slight lifting of her brows at specific mentions, and the restrained modulation of her voice. Miss Marple made a mental note. Politeness often concealed the most revealing motivations. Edith herself had returned to the ribbon near the fountain, her fingers hovering over it before withdrawing once more. Miss Marple watched from a discreet distance, noting how the young woman's behaviour suggested awareness of significance beyond her conscious comprehension. The faintest tremor in her hand, the careful avoidance of disturbing anything further, hinted at the presence of knowledge, or perhaps a memory linked to the object. Even a simple gesture, so subtle it might escape notice, could indicate the delicate balance between fear and recollection, deception and truth. Inspector Craddock, sensing a potential breakthrough, decided to focus on the interactions between the villagers and Hugo Worthing in the days leading up to his death. Miss Marple, quietly observing, realised that the key lay not in the tangible evidence alone, but in the social dynamics, long-standing rivalries, minor slights, and the faint undercurrents of resentment that shaped behaviour. She noted again the attention Mr. Pettigrew paid to the storage area, Mrs. Larkin's recurring glances toward the rosebed, and the subtle tension in Mrs. Carroway's careful movements, all patterns that converged toward a revealing portrait of intention. A sudden movement drew her attention. A shadow flitted along the garden wall, pausing briefly near the storage door before vanishing into the lane. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, connecting this observation with those of the previous evening. Someone was actively engaged in concealing or retrieving something, and the faint lavender scent, the displaced ribbon, and the disturbed soil now formed a coherent sequence, pointing to deliberate activity. By mid-morning, the constables had gathered the villagers in small groups, seeking statements and verifying alibis. Miss Marple moved among them unobtrusively, listening, observing, and cataloguing subtle reactions, the pause before an answer, the faint tightening of a jaw, the involuntary shift of weight. Each revealed more than the spoken words, weaving a thread of understanding that connected motive, opportunity, and concealment. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile as she paused near the fountain. The pieces were aligning, the subtle cues converging into a discernible pattern. The evidence lay not solely in the physical objects, but in the human behaviours intertwined with them. Soon, she reflected, the careful observation of gestures, glances, and faintly expressed anxieties would expose the truth, revealing the identity of the person who had so cleverly hidden their involvement amidst the seemingly ordinary rhythms of St. Mary Mead. By late morning, a gentle tension had settled over the Carroway property. The constables moved efficiently, cataloguing details, while Inspector Craddock continued to interview villagers in small rotating groups. Miss Marple remained at a discreet distance, her attention fixed on the subtle interactions that unfolded with almost theatrical precision. She had long observed that human behaviour, in its smallest gestures and fleeting expressions, often revealed more than words or formal statements ever could. Mr. Pettigrew had returned to the garden, ostensibly inspecting the roses once more. Yet Miss Marple noticed a difference from previous observations. His movements were sharper, his glances more deliberate. A brief pause near the storage door, a slight hesitation before bending to pick up a fallen leaf. Each action seemed purposeful, as if he were retracing steps, testing the boundaries of observation. She filed the behaviour carefully, noting that anxiety often masqueraded as meticulousness, and meticulousness could hide anxiety. Mrs. Caraway, meanwhile, continued her careful supervision of the guests, yet her composure bore a quiet strain. Miss Marple observed the imperceptible flicker of concern when certain topics were raised, the rapid modulation of voice when recounting events, and the subtle manner in which she steered conversations away from potentially revealing subjects. It was evident that she too had noticed something she wished to keep concealed. Edith Somerset lingered near the fountain once more, studying the pale blue ribbon. Miss Marple watched the young woman's fingers hover over it, noting the almost imperceptible tension in her hands. There was hesitation, a conscious restraint that suggested an awareness of the ribbon's significance, though Edith herself may not have fully grasped its implications. Miss Marple considered that such unconscious gestures were often more revealing than deliberate statements. A sudden movement by the storage door drew her attention. A shadow passed fleetingly, bending low and pausing before moving on toward the side lane. The faint lavender scent persisted in the air, subtle yet unmistakable. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, linking the scent with the ribbon, the soil disturbances, and the figures she had observed over the previous day and night. Each element, minor in isolation, now formed a coherent chain of evidence pointing toward deliberate, concealed action. Inspector Craddock, noticing Miss Marple's focused gaze, approached. "Do you see something, Miss Marple?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Merely patterns," she replied softly. "Patterns of behaviour, indications that someone has moved carefully to conceal certain actions. The evidence lies less in the objects themselves than in how people have interacted with them and with each other." As the morning progressed, Miss Marple moved along the edge of the rose garden, noting subtle shifts in posture, fleeting expressions, and small hesitations. She saw how Mr. Pettigrew's eyes repeatedly darted toward the fountain, how Mrs. Larkin's hands fidgeted with her gloves, and how Mrs. Caraway's movements suggested constant vigilance. Each observation built upon the last, forming a lattice of human behaviour that revealed tension, unease, and possibly concealed culpability. By midday, Miss Marple's quiet contemplation had begun to clarify the dynamics among the villagers. Old grievances, minor slights, and subtle resentments all wove together with the recent events, creating a network of motives and opportunities. She recognised that the truth would emerge not through confrontation, but through careful psychological observation, coaxing responses from those who might otherwise remain guarded. Stepping back to observe the scene as a whole, Miss Marple allowed herself a small private satisfaction. The elements of this puzzle, the ribbon, the lavender scent, the footprints, the gestures, and the nuanced interactions, were beginning to converge. Soon, she reflected, the culmination of these careful observations would bring the final revelation, exposing the hand that had so cleverly manipulated events amidst the ordinary. Rhythms of St. Mary Mead. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mao, Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself once more near the rose garden, observing the interplay of villagers and officers with a quiet patience only she could afford. The faint scent of lavender still lingered, mingling with the earthy aroma of disturbed soil. She had spent the day piecing together subtle details, the trampled rose bed, the pale blue ribbon, Mr. Pettigrew's nervous pacing, Mrs. Larkin's repeated glances, and the careful vigilance of Mrs. Caraway. Each clue, each gesture, had formed a mosaic that now revealed its pattern with growing clarity. She called Inspector Craddock aside. "I believe it would be wise to gather the villagers in the drawing room," she suggested. "I think we can now test a theory, gently, of course, but decisively." Craddock agreed, curious and respectful of her reputation, and word spread quickly. One by one, the villagers entered the drawing room, polite smiles masking various degrees of apprehension. Miss Marple moved among them casually, her eyes taking in posture, glances, and the smallest of tremors, each one an unspoken confession in miniature. Her gaze rested last on Mr. Pettigrew. He shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw betraying anxiety beyond the polite calm he had attempted to maintain. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Pettigrew," she began, her voice soft yet carrying a quiet authority. "You were diligent in your garden work yesterday, were you not? Inspecting the flower beds, tending to the roses, and yet curiously you kept returning to the storage area near the side door." Pettigrew's eyes flickered momentarily, but he remained silent, glancing around the room. Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the ease of one reciting mundane observations, though each word was calculated. It was there, among the tools, that certain things were disturbed, not merely by chance, but deliberately, and a faint scent carried from the storage area lingers still. Lavender, as you may know, is quite distinctive. The room was silent, the tension thick. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And yet it was a ribbon, a small pale blue ribbon, that ultimately revealed the connection. Something left behind unnoticed by most, but entirely consistent with your habits, your attention to detail, and your desire to conceal certain movements. Pettigrew's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Miss Marple allowed the silence to deepen, letting the psychological weight of her deductions settle upon him. Then, softly, she said, "You intended to mislead the investigation by creating the appearance of random disturbance, hoping that suspicion would fall elsewhere. But the combination of small, unconscious gestures, the hesitation, the careful placement of objects, and the overlooked scent betrayed the hand that acted with intention." A shiver passed through the room. Pettigrew's composure cracked, his shoulders sagged, and his eyes, wide with recognition of the inevitable, met Miss Marple's steady gaze. I did not intend. It was—" he faltered, voice barely audible. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, gentle, almost conversational. "Yet intention, Mr. Pettigrew, is revealed not in words but in actions, and in St. Mary Mead, nothing, no gesture, no glance, no careful concealment remains hidden forever." Inspector Craddock stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Pettigrew's arm. "I believe we need to continue this discussion at the station," he said, firm but respectful. Pettigrew gave a defeated nod, the finality settling over him like a heavy curtain. As the constables escorted Pettigrew away, Miss Marple remained standing in the drawing-room, observing the villagers' reactions. Relief, tension, and a subtle sense of closure rippled through the assembled group. Mrs. Carroway exhaled quietly, Edith Somerset allowed a faint smile, and Mrs. Larkin's composure returned, though tinged with lingering curiosity at the subtle brilliance of the resolution. Later, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, settling with a cup of tea by the window. Outside St. Mary Mead returned to its gentle rhythms, the village streets calm once more, though with the faintest trace of unease lingering in the shadows, a reminder that beneath the polite surfaces of small-town life, human nature continued to carry both kindness and deception. Miss Marple reflected quietly, as she often did, on the enduring intricacies of human character, the subtleties of observation, and the small telling gestures that revealed far about, more than words ever could. And in that calm she allowed herself a soft, satisfied smile, knowing that truth, patient and precise, had prevailed once again.